This is Dr. Mark Naison. As I enter my 50th year teaching at Fordham, I want to tell you how proud I am to teach in the Bronx. There are many negative images of the Bronx that people come to Fordham with, but most of those stem from years of difficulty from the 1970s through the 1990s. As someone who has done research on the Bronx for the last 20 years, I am here to tell you that the Bronx is actually a great American success story. And when I tell my students what I want them to think of when they look at the Bronx, I use three words: creativity, resilience, and heroism. So let me explain why those three words are ones that we should think of when looking at the Bronx. First of all, the Bronx has produced more varieties of popular music than any place in the United States. Many people know that hip-hop was spawned in the Bronx, but when we go back to the 1940s and 1950s, the Bronx had, at one time, Afro-Cuban music and mambo, jazz, calypso, and doo-wop and rock and roll, all in the same neighborhoods. And it did so because the Bronx was a place where you had Jewish and Italian and Irish communities that received an influx of three different cultural groups: African Americans from the South, West Indians from the Anglophone Caribbean, and Puerto Ricans, each of them bringing their own cultural traditions. And because the Bronx is a borough of apartment buildings, people moved into neighborhoods with people from different cultures, and they shared those cultural traditions. So when you begin to have mambo and Latin music being created in the Bronx, you had Black and Jewish and Italian musicians playing it. When people sang doo-wop, which was an African American tradition, you had Puerto Rican and again Jewish and Italian kids singing along with them. And the sharing of cultures created all these amazing songs, including songs like Shaboom and Maybe, which were some of the earliest popular rock and roll songs, Azúcar, salsa, and this is all happening in Bronx communities even before hip-hop. Then you go into the 1970s when the Bronx went through a period of disinvestment and decay, but young people in the Bronx had a gang truce which reduced violence and started throwing parties where, using two turntables and a mixer, they created a new form of music that was to sweep the world. And that continues up to today. But then, going into the 1990s, you have new immigrant groups coming to the Bronx: Dominicans, West Africans, South Asians, and Mexicans. And one group, people from the Dominican Republic, moved to the Bronx and take a Dominican music called bachata and mix it with rock and roll and hip hop and create a global sensation. A group called Aventura comes out of the Bronx, taking bachata and mixing it with these other forms, and fills Madison Square Garden 4 nights in a row. Then somebody from Aventura, Romeo Santos, breaks off and becomes one of the 5 most popular male musicians in the world. And now, today, we have Cardi B, who is fusing hip-hop with all these forms of Latin music and is probably the most important hip-hop star in the country. And all this is occurring in Bronx neighborhoods, in some cases within walking distance of Fordham, and in other cases within either easy bus or subway ride. So that's the creativity part of it. Now let me talk to you about resilience. During the 1970s, the Bronx went through a terrible period where large portions of its housing stock were abandoned and in some cases burned. People from all over the country came to look at this, thinking that this was something unique to the Bronx. And some of you may remember Howard Cosell in the 1977 World Series saying the Bronx is burning. That image was etched in people's views of how they think about the Bronx. But in the last 40 years, every single abandoned space that used to disfigure the South Bronx has been filled with townhouses, apartment buildings, and shopping centers. And here's what's very interesting about this. What happened in the Bronx in the 70s would happen all over the country, in the Northeast and Midwest especially, in the 80s as factories closed and businesses moved out. There were huge abandoned neighborhoods in Pittsburgh, in Buffalo, in Youngstown, in Detroit, in Baltimore, in Philadelphia. The one difference between all of those places and the Bronx is the only place in the United States where there was massive abandonment, where every single abandoned neighborhood has been rebuilt. And it was rebuilt partly by community organizations that were grassroots, done by local organizers, but also through the churches. One of the biggest organizations rebuilding the Bronx was actually called South Bronx Churches. So and then near Fordham, we had the Northwest Bronx Community and Clergy Coalition in 12 different neighborhoods, which stabilized those communities. So now the Bronx has no more abandoned spaces. And again, this is why I call the Bronx a great American success story and is a symbol of resilience. But then let me talk a little bit about heroism. The Bronx is almost entirely getting new arrivals from people who are immigrants. As I mentioned, the four largest groups now are West African, Dominican, Mexican, and South Asian. And I've had the opportunity to do oral histories with people from these communities. And what's so impressive is how many of these new immigrants to the Bronx work 2, 3, 4 jobs, not only to support their families here, but to send money back home. So, and they have been instrumental in rebuilding neighborhoods, creating new business districts, creating new stores, and even new restaurants. And one of the things about the Bronx that many people don't know, but many more and more food critics realize, is that the Bronx has more great, affordable, ethnic restaurants than almost any place in New York City. Great places to eat: South Asian, Peruvian, Dominican, West African. Now, while the pandemic is going on, I can't encourage people to go, explore those places. But when things ease up, the Bronx is going to be a place where you can have a culinary festival of unprecedented quality. And now I just want to talk to you about the pandemic. And this is another word I use where heroism fits. The Bronx was harder hit by COVID-19 than almost any place in the country, and one of the hardest hit places in the world. Because the Bronx has so many immigrants, so many essential workers, so many people living multi-generational apartments, COVID-19 hit really hard. But what also was incredibly impressive is how people came together to contain this. They wore masks. They took care of their elderly and brought them food so that they wouldn't have to leave their apartments. They kept going to work when most people were staying home. And the result of this is now the Bronx has reduced its COVID-19 exposure to the point where it is no longer a point of danger. So I want you to think about, here at Fordham University, how lucky you are to be surrounded by communities with this kind of history, this kind of record of achievement, this kind of music, this kind of culture, this kind of creativity, and this kind of character. Thank you very much. This is Dr. Mark Naison saying how much I love the Bronx.